December 5th, 1945. Olympia, Washington. The cold from the pavement seeped through her thin-soled shoes. All around Hannah, the air smelled of damp wool, pine needles from street corner wreaths, and the unfamiliar sweetness of roasting nuts. The light from the department store window was a harsh, brilliant yellow, pinning them in its glare. Inside, a pair of pristine white cotton gloves rested on a velvet pedestal next to a sign that simply read, "Sale." A sharp voice cut through the low hum of traffic. What are they doing here? Instinctively, Hannah pulled a younger girl, Emmy, slightly behind her, her own body a fragile shield. The American sergeant escorting them stiffened but did not turn. His voice was low, practiced. "It's all right. Just keep walking." He was following the camp's visible protocol. Engage no one. Provoke nothing. The reflection in the polished glass showed their weary faces superimposed over a scene of impossible peace. This story is a window into a forgotten past. Subscribe to explore more moments that changed history, and share in the comments which country's untold stories you'd like to see. 6 weeks earlier, Fort Lawton, Washington. The truck shuddered to a halt, its brakes hissing in the damp October air. For a long moment, there was only silence, followed by the metallic clank of a bolt being drawn. Out! The word was flat, foreign, a stone skipping across the surface of Hannah's understanding. One by one, the women shuffled out from the darkness of the canvas-covered truck bed into the gray, uniform light of Washington state. The air smelled of salt from the nearby Puget Sound, of wet earth, and of something acrid and chemical. Disinfectant. Fort Lawton was not a battlefield, but it felt like the ghost of one. Rows of identical wooden barracks stood at attention under a sky the color of slate. There were no shouts, no overt brutality as they were herded into a long, low building. The violence was in the silence, in the methodical efficiency of their processing. Hannah kept her eyes downcast, her training as a nurse forcing her to observe even when she wanted to shut everything out. She noted the clean floors, the organized lines, the way the American soldiers moved with a kind of detached purpose. This was not chaos. It was a system. They were being dismantled, piece by piece. Their names were taken, replaced with numbers inked onto wooden tags. Their belongings were confiscated, each item inspected and dropped into a burlap sack with an indifferent thud. The language barrier was a wall. Commands were given in short, guttural bursts of English, accompanied by sharp hand gestures. Stand here, move there, hands up. Hannah and the others complied, their movements sluggish with fear and exhaustion. She felt her identity peeling away, leaving only the raw core of a prisoner. Number 734, that was her name now. This process, she knew, was compliant with international law, a cold comfort that did little to warm her. Finally, she reached the last station in the processing line, bedding. A female officer with tired eyes and hair the color of straw stood behind a wooden counter stacked high with folded gray blankets. She looked no older than Hannah. As Hannah stepped forward, she braced herself for a shove, for the blanket to be thrown at her feet. Instead, the officer picked up a blanket and placed it directly into Hannah's outstretched arms. The wool was coarse and heavy, smelling faintly of mothballs. For a single, startling second, their eyes met. There was no pity in the American's gaze, but there was no contempt either. There was only a quiet acknowledgement of their shared, strange reality. The officer gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Then the moment was over. Hannah was gestured onward, clutching the rough blanket to her chest. It was the first solid, real thing she had held in hours. She was led out of the processing building and toward a barrack at the far end of the compound. The door creaked open into a long room filled with rows of metal cots. The silence inside was heavier than any sound she had ever heard. She was safe for now. But as she stood there, number 734, she understood that survival was only the beginning. The first few days bled into one another, a uniform gray of roll calls, bland meals, and the suffocating silence of the barracks. Routine became a shield against thought. Hannah performed her assigned tasks, weeding the barren vegetable patch, scrubbing floors, with a detached precision that kept memory at bay. But in the quiet moments, the emptiness threatened to consume her. She needed an anchor, something more than the scratchy wool of her blanket. She found it in a small, seldom-used building at the edge of the compound, identified by a simple, hand-painted sign, "Library." The room smelled of dust and decaying paper, a scent she had always associated with comfort. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes, streamed through a grimy window. The shelves were sparsely populated, but they were filled with books. For the first time since arriving, a flicker of her old self returned. She ran her fingers along the spines, a reverent gesture. Moby Dick. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. A Farewell to Arms. The titles were familiar, names she had heard of in her studies, but the words themselves were an indecipherable code. The hope that had bloomed in her chest withered. The library was not a sanctuary. It was another wall, a testament to her profound isolation. Every book was a locked door. Disheartened, she pulled a random volume from the shelf. Tucked inside was a forgotten bookmark, a stiff cardboard library card from a place called Seattle Public Library. The name written on it was faded, Germanic-sounding. It was a ghost, a small proof that someone else had been here, had sought refuge in these same pages. She clutched the card in her hand, a tangible link to a world of knowledge she could not access. She was about to leave when she saw it, a low shelf tucked away in a corner, holding a small collection of children's books. They were worn, their covers softened by countless hands. One had a bright blue cover depicting a soaring eagle. The title was simple enough for her to decipher: Our America. Inside the cover was a stamp, donated by the American Red Cross. Hannah sat on the dusty floor and opened the book. It was filled with simple, vibrant illustrations. A wide, churning river labeled Mississippi, a jagged range of snow-capped peaks called the Rockies, a forest of impossibly tall trees named redwoods. There was no propaganda here, no soldiers, no war. There was only the quiet, undeniable beauty of a land. A sharp pang of longing for the cherry groves of her home, for the view of Fujisan on a clear day, pierced through her. How could this enemy land be so beautiful? The question was a painful one. She traced the shape of a mountain with her finger, then looked at the simple word beneath it. Mountain. She whispered it aloud, the foreign syllables feeling clumsy on her tongue. Then she turned the page and found the next word. The lessons in the library became Hannah's secret ritual, a small act of reclamation in a world that sought to erase her. But the days were still defined by labor. Her new assignment was in the laundry, a cavernous building that perpetually hummed with the churning of washing machines and smelled of industrial-strength soap. The air was thick with steam, clinging to her hair and clothes, a constant damp weight. The work was grueling. They sorted mountains of military-issued clothing, khaki uniforms, rough-spun sheets, and stiff denim, their hands growing raw from the harsh lye and boiling water. A young American guard, barely a man, watched over them. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a constant pressure, his boredom often curdling into a quiet antagonism. He would lean against the wall, chewing on a matchstick, his eyes lingering on anyone who slowed their pace. "Got all day?" he muttered once as Hannah paused to wring the stinging water from her hands. The sarcasm was a small, sharp jab, a reminder of her powerlessness. She resolved to give him no reason to speak to her again. She would work with the diligence of a machine. One morning, a new shipment of supplies arrived for the laundry workers. Among them was a box of thin, white cotton work gloves. The supervising officer tossed a pair to each woman. Hannah caught hers. She turned them over in her hands. They were simple, mass-produced, and flimsy, but they were white. Clean. The texture was familiar, a ghost of the sanitized cotton gloves she had worn in the operating theater, in the quiet, sterile halls of the hospital where she had trained. For a moment, she was not prisoner 734 in a steam-filled laundry. She was Nurse Tanaka, a woman with a purpose, with skills that mattered. A person defined not by her captivity, but by her capacity to care and to bring order to chaos. She pulled the gloves on. They fit snugly. Protected by the thin layer of cotton, she returned to the vat of wet laundry. Her movements changed. They were no longer the clumsy motions of a laborer, but the precise, efficient actions of a professional. She folded sheets with crisp, geometric corners. She sorted garments with an unwavering focus. The work was the same, but she was not. The young guard watched her, his brow slightly furrowed in confusion. He saw a prisoner working harder, faster, but he could not see the transformation that had occurred. He could not understand that in the simple act of putting on a pair of white cotton gloves, a woman had reclaimed a piece of herself. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it. For the rest of the day, he remained silent. Sunday arrived with a different quality of silence. The usual hum of camp activity was muted, the work details suspended. It was a day of mandated rest, a strange and unsettling pause that left too much room for thought. Hannah sat on the steps of her barrack, watching a weak sun attempt to break through the persistent layer of clouds. From the town beyond the wire fence, a faint sound drifted on the wind, the tolling of a church bell. It was a mournful, lonely sound, a call to a faith that was not hers, in a world she could not join. Listening felt like an act of treason. She saw a few of the other women turn their backs to the sound, their expressions hardening into masks of defiance. It was easier to hate a faceless enemy than one who worshipped a god. The sound grew closer, clearer, emanating not from the town, but from a small radio crackling to life in the open window of the camp office. A choir began to sing. The harmony was rich and complex, a wave of sound that washed over the sterile compound. Hannah did not understand the English words, but the emotion was unmistakable. It was a song of devotion, of sorrow, and of hope. She felt a knot of conflict tighten in her stomach. This was the music of her captors. It was the soundtrack to her imprisonment. Yet, she could not bring herself to walk away. Then, the choir shifted to a new hymn. The melody was simple, familiar, one she had heard years ago from a Christian mission near her hometown. The tune was universal, a gentle current that flowed beneath the rocks of language and war. It was a song about grace, about being lost and then found. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The men who guarded her, the ones who represented the vast military machine that had destroyed her world, they sought solace in this music. They prayed for the same forgiveness, the same peace that was the universal prayer of the human heart. The rigid line she had drawn between her people and theirs began to dissolve. The hymn ended, followed by a brief moment of static before a preacher's voice began to drone. But Hannah was no longer listening to the radio. She was looking across the yard at the young guard from the laundry. He stood near the office, his cap held in his hands, his head slightly bowed. He was not looking at the prisoners. He was looking at some distant point only he could see, lost in the music. For the first time, Hannah saw him not as a uniform, not as a symbol of her oppression, but simply as a young man far from home, listening to a song that meant something to him. The fragile peace Hannah had found in the Sunday music did not last. Reality intruded a few days later in the form of a discarded newspaper left on a bench in the mess hall. It was the local town paper, thin and smelling of fresh ink. Hannah's English was still rudimentary, but she could recognize certain words. She saw a POW camp next to a photograph of their own front gate. Then she saw the headline on the editorial page, a single sharp word: coddled. She carried the paper back to the barracks and found Akiko, a woman who had been a literature student in Tokyo. Akiko's English was the best among them. At first she refused to read it, but the anxious faces of the other women pressed in on her. She finally relented, her voice low and strained as she translated the angry words. The writer, a local man whose son had died at Iwo Jima, questioned why his tax dollars were being used to feed and house the enemy. He wrote of rationing, of sacrifice, of local boys who would never come home. Why, he demanded, were Japanese prisoners being treated with a gentleness that his own son had never known? Source: Washington State Historical Society, War Records. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. A chill spread through the barracks that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. The fear they had felt upon arrival returned, sharper this time. Before, it had been a fear of the unknown. Now it had a face and a voice. It was the face of the grocer in town, the voice of the milkman. The professional neutrality of the guards suddenly seemed like a thin veneer, barely concealing the same hatred that festered just beyond the fence. Every glance felt heavy with judgment. The tension stretched for 2 days. Then, a new notice appeared on the main bulletin board by the administrative office. It was a crisp, typewritten memo from the camp commandant, addressed to all personnel. Akiko was summoned again. This time, her voice held a note of confusion as she translated. The memo was a dry, formal recitation of Articles 46 through 53 of the Geneva Convention. It was a stark reminder of the camp's legal obligation to provide humane treatment, adequate food, and medical care to all prisoners. It concluded with a stern warning that any deviation from these regulations would result in severe disciplinary action. The newspaper was not mentioned, but the message was clear. Hannah was left deeply unsettled. She had seen 2 faces of America in as many days. One was the raw, grieving anger of its people. The other was the cold, unyielding letter of its laws. Which one held the real power here? That evening, at the final roll call, the supervising officer read out a list of names. Hannah's was among them. "You will prepare for an escorted trip to Olympia tomorrow at 0900 hours, he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "To procure necessary personal items." A stunned silence fell over the assembled women. They were being sent into the town that had just declared its hatred for them. The morning of the trip arrived, gray and cold. A nervous energy crackled through the barracks as the chosen women prepared themselves. Hannah, however, was preoccupied with a more immediate concern. Emmy, the youngest of their group, who was also on the list for the trip, had woken with a feverish pallor and shivering hands. It was not a serious illness, but she was weak, and the thought of taking her into a potentially hostile town filled Hannah with a protective dread. At breakfast, the atmosphere in the mess hall was thick with unspoken anxiety. Hannah watched Emmy push the bland oatmeal around her bowl, unable to eat. The camp's medical policy was strict. A low-grade fever would not warrant special rations or exclusion from a scheduled activity. Hannah felt the familiar weight of helplessness, bound by rules she could not challenge. She looked around the noisy hall, her eyes landing on the tables. They were covered in red and white checkered tablecloths. It was an odd detail, a touch of domesticity that was completely at odds with their surroundings. The cloths were worn but impeccably clean, a small, stubborn insistence on order in the midst of institutional life. With a sigh, Hannah took her and Emmy's trays to the serving line for a cup of water. The cook was a heavy-set older man, a civilian whose face was set in a permanent scowl and who never spoke to the prisoners. As Hannah approached, he glanced at her, then past her, his gaze briefly settling on Emmy at the table. Hannah saw a flicker of something in his eyes before he turned away. He took her tray. His movements were swift and economical. He ladled the water, and then, his back mostly turned to the supervising guard, he did something else. He placed an extra slice of bread, thicker than the usual ration, and a tin cup filled with steaming milk onto her tray. He pushed it back towards her without meeting her eyes, and immediately turned to the next person. The entire transaction took less than 3 seconds. Hannah stood frozen for a moment, stunned. The warmth from the cup seeped into her cold fingers. This was not the cold, impersonal adherence to law she had seen from the commandant. This was not the anonymous hatred from the newspaper. This was something else entirely, a small, forbidden act of human kindness. She carried the tray back to the table as if it were a sacred offering. Emmy's eyes widened at the sight of the milk. A fragile gratitude passed between them, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fever. Holding the cup, Hannah felt a small measure of her own strength return. The world outside the fence was still a place of fear, but the cook's quiet gesture was a potent reminder that it was not a monolith. It was made of individuals, and some of them, perhaps, still chose to be kind. The ride into Olympia was a dizzying blur of motion and color. After weeks confined to the muted grays and browns of the camp, the world outside the truck's canvas flaps seemed shockingly vibrant. Cars, impossibly sleek and shiny, sped past them. Houses with tidy green lawns and plumes of smoke curling from their chimneys looked like illustrations from her picture book. When the truck stopped, the sergeant's orders were curt and clear. Single file, no talking to anyone. You stay with me at all times. Any trouble, and this is the last trip for anyone. The unspoken weight of that responsibility settled on all of them. Stepping onto the pavement was like stepping into another world. The sheer sensory input was overwhelming. The air, thick with the unfamiliar smells of automobile exhaust and roasting nuts from a street cart, was filled with a cacophony of new sounds. The rumble of traffic, the distant clang of a streetcar, the murmur of American voices laughing and chatting as they passed. Hannah felt like a ghost, haunting a landscape that should not exist. The buildings were whole, their windows unbroken. Women walked by in brightly colored coats and stylish hats, their faces free from the gaunt strain of war. A bakery window was piled high with glazed pastries and crusty loaves of bread, a display of casual abundance that felt more alien than any military hardware. This was the America she had read about in the newspaper, the one that resented feeding its prisoners. Seeing this, she could almost understand why. She kept her eyes fixed on the sergeant's back, trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. People stared. Some looks were curious, others were hard with a hostility that made her skin prickle. But most simply glanced at the strange procession and then looked away, too absorbed in their own peaceful lives to care. They had walked 2 blocks down the main street when the sergeant, who had seemed intent on reaching a specific destination, stopped abruptly. He said nothing, simply pausing on the sidewalk and nodding his head slightly toward the large plate glass window beside them. It was a department store, its name spelled out in elegant gold letters, Rhodes. Confused by the unscheduled stop, Hannah followed his gaze. The window was a brightly lit stage, showcasing a perfect miniature American living room. There was a comfortable-looking armchair, a polished wooden radio, and a tall lamp that cast a warm, inviting glow. And resting on a small table, placed just so, was a pair of pristine, folded white cotton gloves. Her breath caught. It was a scene of impossible, ordinary peace. Hannah stared into the brightly lit window, mesmerized. The scene was so perfect, so impossibly serene. The white cotton gloves seemed to glow under the focused beam of the lamp. For a moment, the sounds of the street faded away, and she could almost imagine a life where one could simply come home, remove one's gloves, and sit down to listen to the radio. The cold from the pavement seeped through the thin soles of her shoes, a distant physical reminder that she was not part of this world, merely a spectator. A sharp voice sliced through her reverie. "What are they doing here?" The words were filled with a venom that made the air feel suddenly colder. Hannah's head snapped up. A man stood a few feet away, his face contorted in a mask of rage. He was not old, but his eyes were ancient with a grief that had curdled into hate. The quiet fear that had hummed beneath the surface of the day now roared to life. Instinctively, Hannah moved, her body a fragile shield for Emmy, who flinched back from the raw hatred in the man's voice. The American sergeant escorting them went rigid, his posture shifting into something more defensive. His voice was low, a practiced command meant to de-escalate. "It's all right. Just keep walking." But they couldn't. The man took a step forward, blocking their path. "Walking? They shouldn't even be breathing our air." "My brother," before he could finish, another figure stepped into the tense space between them. He wore a different uniform, a deep blue one, and a polished badge on his chest identified him as the town's chief of police. He was older than the sergeant, his face etched with the weary lines of a man who had seen too much trouble. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "That's enough, Jim," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "They're here under military escort. It's official business. Go on home." The man named Jim looked ready to protest, his fists clenched, but something in the police chief's steady gaze made him hesitate. He spat on the sidewalk, a final, futile gesture of contempt, then turned and stalked away down the street. The immediate danger was over. The sergeant gave the chief a curt, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement between 2 men in uniform. Hannah was trembling, not from the cold, but from shock. She had expected the law to be on the side of its own people. She had expected to be the object of its scorn. She had never, in any scenario, imagined that it would be her shield. She turned her gaze back to the window. Amidst the tableau of domestic peace, the white cotton gloves sat, pristine and undisturbed, entirely untouched by the ugliness that had just unfolded. The street noises rushed back in to fill the silence, but Hannah heard nothing. Her world had shrunk to the few square feet of pavement in front of the department store window. The immediate threat was gone, but the aftershock lingered, a tremor in her very bones. She tried to steady herself by focusing on the glass, but she no longer saw the armchair or the radio. She saw only the reflection. It was a ghost superimposed over the golden-lit scene. A pale, gaunt woman in a shapeless gray coat. Her face a mask of exhaustion. Behind her, the smaller, more frightened ghost of Emmy. Their bleak reality was laid over a dream of American peace, a transparent layer of suffering on a world of comfort. The contrast was a physical ache in her chest. This was the nation that had won. This effortless prosperity was the prize, and the ruin of her own home had been the cost. A familiar, bitter resentment began to rise, but it faltered, unable to take root. The police chief's intervention had complicated everything. He had not acted out of kindness. He had acted out of duty, upholding a law that, in that moment, had valued order over a citizen's grief. He had defended the enemy to protect the peace. What kind of a country was this, that held its own principles higher than its own anger? Hannah stared at her own reflection, at the weary eyes staring back at her. For months, she had seen only a prisoner, a number, a survivor stripped of all identity. But now, in the strange clarity born of shock, she saw something else. She saw the set of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders, the posture of a woman who had once navigated the controlled chaos of a hospital ward. She saw the observant, steady gaze of a nurse. She saw a woman who had endured. In that instant, the reflection ceased to be a symbol of her defeat. It became a testament to her resilience. The future, which for so long had been a black, featureless void, suddenly admitted a single, remote flicker of light. The life represented in the window, a life of peace, of purpose, of simple, ordinary moments, was not hers. But for the first time, it did not feel like an absolute impossibility. "Time to move," the sergeant's voice was gentle for him. As they turned away, Hannah's gaze met the police chief's one last time. He was still standing nearby, watching the street. He offered her a brief, impersonal nod. It was not a gesture of pity or friendship. It was a simple acknowledgement of her existence within the bounds of his town and his law. That quiet, professional recognition settled deep inside her, more grounding and more meaningful than sympathy ever could be. The journey back to Fort Lawton was almost completely silent. The vibrant, chaotic energy of Olympia had been replaced by a heavy, contemplative atmosphere inside the truck. No one spoke of what had happened. There were no words for it yet. When they passed back through the gates, the familiar grayness of the camp did not feel as oppressive to Hannah. It felt quiet, a place where the dizzying contradictions of the day might finally be sorted. Back in the barracks, the silence was different from before. It was not empty, but resonant, filled with the echoes of the things she had seen. The angry grief in one man's eyes, the weary duty in another's. The impossible shine on the automobiles and the quiet kindness of a cook. Her mind struggled to hold these opposing truths in the same space. It would be so much easier to cling to the simple, righteous anger she had arrived with. Embracing this new, confusing complexity felt dangerous, like letting go of the only rock she had in a turbulent sea. She felt a deep, urgent need to record what had happened, to give it form. She retrieved a precious sheet of thin paper and a small pencil stub from her modest belongings. She would write a letter home. The censors would read it, of course. so she would have to be careful. She smoothed the paper on her cot, ready to write the expected lines about her health and the changing seasons. But her hand paused over the page. Such words felt hollow, a lie. Her gaze fell upon her work gloves from the laundry, which lay beside her. They were no longer white, but a soft gray, smudged with the evidence of her labor. She picked them up and placed them next to the blank sheet of paper. They were the truth of her current life. Worn, stained, but useful. They were a world away from the perfect, untouchable gloves in the department store window. It was easy to write about suffering. It was the expected narrative of a prisoner of war. It was far harder to articulate the meaning of a lawman defending his nation's enemy, or to describe a prosperity so vast it defied comprehension. Hannah finally put the pencil to the paper. She wrote not of hardship or of hope. She wrote of 2 pairs of cotton gloves, one that represented a life of unimaginable peace, and another that represented the dignity she found in her own daily work. She wrote of a police chief who honored a principle that seemed bigger than patriotism. She did not try to explain what it meant. She ended the letter with a simple, honest admission. I do not understand this place, but I am learning to see. For Hannah, sitting in the quiet dusk of the barrack, that profound confusion felt more real, and therefore more true, than any simple certainty could ever be. Yokohama, 1988 I. Hana Tanaka never returned to the United States. After her repatriation in 1946, she resumed her nursing studies, her hands finding their purpose again in the quiet, orderly wards of a nation rebuilding itself. She married a kind ceramics teacher, raised 2 children, and grew old in a small house with a garden that overlooked the sea. The years at Fort Lawton did not become a scar, but rather a smooth, cool stone of a memory she would turn over in her mind on quiet afternoons. She rarely spoke of it, for there were no simple words to describe what she had learned. How could she explain the 2 Americas she had seen? The one of rage and grief that shouted at her from a passing stranger, and the one of wearied duty that shielded her behind the authority of a badge. The one of hateful newspaper editorials, and the one of a silent cook who offered a secret cup of warm milk. This morning, like most, she prepared to tend to her chrysanthemums. On the small wooden table by her door, next to a pair of rusted shears, lay a pair of simple white cotton gloves. They were for gardening, to keep the dirt from under her fingernails, but she was never able to put them on without a flicker of remembrance. As she drew the soft fabric over her wrinkled hands, the memory of the department store window returned to her, not as a ghost, but as a defining lesson. She had gone to America a soldier's nurse, trained to see the world in uniform shades of friend and foe. But in front of that impossible glass, she had learned that a country was never just one thing. It was 1,000 contradictions held in a fragile balance. She adjusted the fit of the gloves, the clean cotton a familiar comfort. The war had taught her about enemies. The peace that followed had taught her about people. And in the quiet wisdom of her old age, she knew which lesson had mattered more. Hana slid open the door and stepped out into the gentle light of her garden.